So, welcome everyone. For the next like 20 minutes, we're just going to talk about Angular and how awesome it is. So, let's first try to understand, like, just set the tone of this presentation. So in 20 minutes, of course, you're not going to learn what Angular is, but it's this session is going to like be enough for you to get started, get a flavor of what Angular is, and hopefully like know the difference between what React is, what Angular is, and what are the capabilities of Angular. So with this presentation, you'll be able to understand like what Angular is made of, and hopefully take like a wise decision if you're choosing, like, if you're in a place where you want to choose between which framework or what to do for my front end of the app that, the project that I'm working on. So this would be quite helpful for you. Introducing myself, I go by Wafa Wahida S on social media. I'm a software engineer from Qatar. So for me, like, I started with developing or like just getting introduced to the web when I was in grade 6. And I started with like HTML and Flash. I belong to the Flash era. So it was really fun, like doing front ends of the apps, and I learned a lot along the way. Like, I mean, before even I decided that I'll become a software engineer, I was building web pages. So yeah, alhamdulillah, things happened, and like I picked up a lot of tools and frameworks along the line, and I really like to share what I learned on Twitter and other blog platforms where I at times blog, and through events like these. So without further ado, let's start. So if you're looking for like like a front end as your career path, these are like the top skills that are required. So in order to become a front-end developer, you'll need to know HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and like all these frameworks out there, and what testing or debugging means. And not just that, like, if you're new to front-end, these might seem like, okay, there's so many frameworks out there, what do I start with? It can get challenging. So in order for us to like even just understand and say, like, even if you know what these frameworks are, even if you're a person looking for jobs, you need to first understand like how the web works, and try to like just understand like the few concepts, and then try to dive deep into, okay, I need React for my project, or I want to become a React developer, or I want to become an Angular developer. So this these fundamentals will help us make some informed decisions. Let's just skim over them. Like, of course, most of you might be familiar with this already. So how does the web work? Like, if you think about the browser screens that you use every day, you're just like typing a URL, it goes as a HTTP request, it talks to a server sitting somewhere remote where the website is hosted, all the website files are there, and whatever the server responds as, it comes back to your browser in 3 forms. That's the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And you as developers, or as students, or whoever like looking to become a front-end developer, or a person who's trying to choose between React or Angular, needs to know this, because it's how well you like manage your app. The response is just gonna be HTML, CSS, JavaScript. But where do these frameworks come into play? This is like the entire workflow of any web app or anything that you make. This is how it's gonna land up into. The response will be HTML, CSS, JavaScript. So and also like the web page that you see, it's made of like document objects. So it'll have like the HTML, head, body, title, text, all these things. So this we know, most of you, or you may not, and this might be a good introduction for you to like start Googling these terms and just build your skills on that. Where does JavaScript come into play? And where does like all these frameworks like React and Angular come into play? That's what we're trying to answer through these fundamentals. So here we do know like the response that comes is JavaScript, CSS, HTML, and this is like how the code looks. But what HTML is kind of bringing to the response that you get is actually content and structure, and CSS is just like styling it and beautifying it. Whereas JavaScript is what is like bringing the entire web page to life. This is what we need to understand as concepts. And nowadays, if you talk about just websites, there's so much more to it, right? Like there's not just, you know, a static page which looks good and you can do like, you know, some form submissions. There's more than that to it. I mean, think about Instagram or Twitter or any other app, like, you know, any other app that does analytics. If you're using social mention or hashtagify or any app to do your tweet analysis, any web app where you're even Google Analytics for that matter, like any web app or anything that you're trying to interact with, it has a lot of interactivity. It's not just a simple form, register form, where you're just like trying to keep up. And if you'll as a front-end developer, or like, you know, you'll be very likely to build these kind of apps, because it's no longer about, you know, just static web pages, right? Like you're going to be building complex apps. So your app is going to have like a lot of interactivity, which is called UI events. And these events are updating like how your page looks. So that's like, you know, events updating the state with JavaScript. So this was all the, you know, background that we needed. So now, like, if you think of, you know, I just use these two terms. I use websites and web apps. But can you guys tell me the difference in the chat? Like if you know what the difference between a website and a web app is? Go ahead, like no judgments, just whatever comes to your mind. What do you think is a web app or a website? I mean, they're used very interchangeably these days, but you know, they're very different. And we as front-end developers or aspiring front-end developers want to know the difference, right? Website, thanks Ahmed. Ahmed is saying that website is what the user sees and web app is what the developer uses. Oh, that's good. That's, you're thinking more like developer user point of view. That's nice. Do any of you want to take? Okay, we can look at the chat if more responses come in. But to just like sum up, you know, if you web app is unified based on web answer. Web application is user interactive. Wow, more answers. Nice. I like to see interactivity. Okay, a web application is a software or program which is accessible using any web browser. A website is, okay, basically you're saying that only web app is accessible by web browser? Okay, which have a single, okay, that was very tricky, but you know, if web app is more functional than a website. Yay, I think I like Jian's answer the best so far. It's very concise. Web app is more functional than a website. Yes, that's right. So if I have to like, you know, go a little more deep and tell you like what's the difference between a web app and a website, you know, we as humans are different, right? Like we have different personalities. The way I describe websites and web apps are like, websites are introverts. They keep it to themselves. They just give out information. You know, they're like silent. They keep it to themselves. Very less interactivity. They're silent. They don't have like a lot of features, like Jian said. And it's static. It's just information. It's supposed to give out information to the users going through their website. Whereas a web application is an extrovert. You know, extrovert as in it's more interactive. You can you know, it requires you to, you know, like do a lot of actions. There's like a lot of action reaction going on, like you know, a lot of interactivity, a lot of functionality, like Jian said. And you know, these frameworks, especially like React and Angular or whatnot, help you build web apps. You can build websites using them, but they help you build web apps, and very helpful when it comes to a web app, because web apps are very complex to make. You know, they're extroverted, right? Like they have so many events. You have to keep up with the state of the web page. It's wild. It's all over the place. So it gets very crazy. Yeah. So that's the difference. A website is static. It's informational, whereas a web app is interactive. Or if you want to remember my way, website is introvert, web app is extrovert. So yeah, I mean, we spoke about a lot of what do you call, we covered fundamentals in less than like 2 minutes. And we also saw the difference between website and what do you call, web app. Now, like, let's think about which, I mean, this is the question we were discussing from the beginning of the chat, right? Like from the beginning of this, what do you call it, presentation. So we're all often, like, as job seekers, as students trying to become front-end developers, as developers who are doing front-end, which front-end framework should I choose? So for us, it's really important to understand these differences in order to appreciate what Angular is. So this presentation is an introduction to Angular in that sense. For this, like, this is the last informational kind of slide I share, and after this, into Angular. We need to, like, we just know that there are a lot of JavaScript front-end, frameworks, but we always, like, get confused between, there's React as a library, Angular as a framework. There's a lot of, like, interchanging terminology, again, just like website and web app. If you can tell me the difference between, from what difference between framework and library, like, it doesn't have to be tied to front end. Do you guys want to try, like, answering? If you have any, feel free to share in the chat. What do you think is the difference between a framework and library, based on, like, your experience in Python, or, I mean, anything, like, you as a developer so far? Framework is much structured than library. Good. A library is a collection of helpers. That's nice. I love your answers. Yeah, that's good. So yeah, you're right. You're indeed right. So framework is more structured than library. Library is, like, a bunch of helper functions. If I have to, like, I wouldn't get your name, but yeah. So as our friend in chat is saying, he or she is right. This is what it is. So the difference, if you understand in one line about what a framework or a library is, imagine you're writing a front-end code, and if your code is called helper functions, like, import React, do this, at every JavaScript file you have, that's probably you're just using React, or you're using the helper functions to inside your project. You use those. Whereas a framework is different, because you write code inside the framework. In Angular, what you do is, like, in the Angular syntactic way, there's a lot of syntactic sugar, decorators, there's that, a lot of things going on. So I think I almost gave away the answer. React is a library, Angular is a framework, and yes, if you're writing code which calls a library in order to make use of some functionalities, then that's very likely a library that you're using. If you're writing code in like a big infrastructure kind of way, like, where you're changing the style of your code, like using a lot of syntax, you're probably using a framework, which is mostly Angular. So this is one of the differences we had to understand. Yeah, like Omnia saying, framework is supposed to make our access to libraries and functions easier. True. Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, before we even, like, think about different frameworks and libraries, we need to first understand, right? Why do we need these? We saw the difference between web apps, websites, and we saw how overwhelming it is to deal with the extrovert person, the web apps, right? Like, it's so hard to understand where they are. The apps, it's really hard to understand what they're doing right now. Imagine being a coder, like, I mean, as a developer of that app, it becomes really overwhelming for you to understand, okay, what is my app doing right now? That's where frameworks come in. So for making web apps which are complex, and for you to understand what application is doing right now in the DOM, as in, like, it gets hard, like, especially if you're used to JavaScript, how asynchronous it is, and how, like, dynamically typed it is. Like, actually, experts of the JavaScript world admit that they don't know how JavaScript reacts. So it's to that extent, especially for a language like JavaScript, frameworks are very important. And especially we need frameworks because, we're mostly building web apps, and we want to understand where the app is. Like, you have a lot of data coming in. If you imagine building a Twitter app, like your app which is consuming Twitter API or any other books API, any like, different kind of data depending on the app you're building on, it gets very overwhelming for you to say, okay, this is where this is the tweet that the user posted right now, and this is the analysis I'm doing right now, and this is what my end user is doing. Like, there's so many, factors. So it's very hard for you to understand what your app is doing, and that's why we need frameworks. Boom. Now we get into, so this is again, keeping the UI in sync with the state is hard. That's why we need frameworks. If anyone asks you why are you learning so many frameworks, or why do we need frameworks at all, this should be your answer. So I mean, what are the things, like other than that, to consider when you're trying to build such a front end, a web app, which is like dealing with a lot of things. You want your app to be scalable, like accessible by a lot of people. You want it to be responsive, and you're not the only one working on this app, right? Like, if it's big enough, there's like probably a team behind it. Or if it's an app which is going to be successful, even if it's your personal project, you want to maintain it. I mean, these days we write code and then we don't understand what we wrote yesterday, right? Like, I mean, that's the kind of state where we are when we code. So also, like, the performance of the app, your app should be very fast and it should not consume a lot of resources. Imagine your app is dealing with a lot of data, and once the person is opening your app, say, like, I don't know, GDG Sharjah's app, and someone just opened their website, and it just crashes, because there's so much data, so many images or whatever. Like, it's very costly for the user to load. So these things should be minimized, and a framework or a library should be capable of doing these things for you. So now, what is Angular? The benefits of Angular is that it helps you develop flexibly. It helps you create one-page apps. It helps you use something called data binding, and helps you load in a very fastest way. And it is, if you guys are used to design patterns, or MVC is a pattern that they use, model view control. This is how, like, traditional Java frameworks, they kind of build, that's one way of structuring apps. So Angular makes use of this, makes use of the MVC model view control pattern, and leverages on top of that. It's very cross-platform. It's very simple and expressive. Just like dynamic imperative programming. Dynamic is like, you don't have to tell explicitly everything. Whereas imperative is like, you have to tell everything. With Angular, it's like a smooth line between both. So it's simple and expressive to use, and the speed and performance control, it's already optimized more. And in terms of, like, the user base, it has the maximum user base. Like, in case you're stuck with anything. Okay. Now let's get into what Angular is made of, right? Like, we know that we just saw HTML, CSS, JavaScript to be the, like, the response that loads up on your browser once the page loads, right? What is Angular made of that helps it render these JavaScript pages? That helps you render these HTML, like, that helps you build these pages which are made of these things. So we're gonna now look at what Angular is made of. And then slowly get into, okay, how does Angular does routing? And if we have more time, we'll look into state management as well. The necessity behind Angular, like how you can manage state effectively with tools like state management. So we're gonna, like, take it very lighthearted. If you have any questions, you're gonna like, shoot them on the chat here. Yeah, there's a question already. Will the use of framework add more overhead to the application in terms of learning? Or I mean, there are so many factors to the question that you're asking. Which IDE do you use? In IDE is just like pure development environment, right? It can be VS Code, or even you can see, like, if you want to whip up some code example, You can also use online IDs. Okay, the follow-up of the question is, will the use of framework add more overhead to the application in terms of performance and user experience? Not really. Not really. In fact, you'll be more like in control of what each of them, where you can minimize, like cut down. For example, if you're using some fancy fonts, Angular can exactly tell you how much this font is, how much of space this font takes to load up every time the user is loading. So it gives you a lot of control on choosing what to do. But at the end of the day, the decision is yours. So the framework as such does not add a lot of dependency, because it uses a lot of things like TypeScript and RxJS and Angular itself as a framework, but it's not that heavy. When it loads, it's just JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. It's not gonna load the framework. I mean, like, you can't think like you download Angular and it's like, okay, maybe like 46 KB, and that's how much like your app is going to take to download Angular. There's no Angular once you get to the browser. That's what I'm trying to say. So of course, it doesn't have any effect on performance. In fact, it helps you improve it. It gives you control, and you can decide on what to choose, what not to choose for your apps. So now getting back to the presentation. So Angular is made of a lot of things. We saw like the HTML, CSS, JavaScript being the response, right? See how Angular uses it and why does it need in the first place. So TypeScript is just like JavaScript, but more organized. And it has optional static typing. If you've probably written like 5 lines of JavaScript in your life, you'll understand. I mean, if you deeply question yourself, you're very sure that you don't understand. In JavaScript, you don't have variables where you can say int or string. They're all let or let const these days with ES. But then var. It's dynamically typed. The browser picks up these variables, and you have no idea. This adds a lot of trouble to the developers while debugging, because you don't know, what kind of data you're expecting, how your app should react. Since your browser is picking up these types dynamically, it gets really overwhelming. So TypeScript avoids all that. TypeScript is like a superscript of JavaScript, and in simple words, it's JavaScript that scales. So just like JavaScript, you can use it on any browser, any host. At the end of the day, you don't render TypeScript. You'll be rendering JavaScript. So what Angular does is it helps you write TypeScript, but at the end of the day, it compiles all your TypeScript down to control. We all love control, believe me. We all want to know, we all want to avoid, it allows you to encapsulate JavaScript. I mean, as in define types to JavaScript. That's what it does. So you can have these interfaces, you can have these types, which are like classes, and you can define, okay, this is how my API response is going to look like. It gives you more maintainability, and that's what we're looking for as developers, right? So also, it uses Java. Reactive programming is just like this as the input, that's going to be my output. Reactive programming is where it's more event-driven programming. Remember, we spoke about events and how web apps are extroverted. You can control your app by writing code in terms of events, saying that, okay, this is the state of my app after this event. These kind of things can happen with reactive programming. So TypeScript and RxJS are baked into Angular. At times we think that we need more freedom, and I don't want TypeScript and I don't want RxJS. The learning curve is very high. I mean, it's a steep learning curve when you want to learn Angular, when you're getting started with Angular, but then it's worth it. I've written React and JavaScript like equally. I had a very easy time learning React, whether it was just like, my code is super messy because it's not controlling, and it doesn't have these design patterns in place. It doesn't impose me to use Typescript. It's up to my choice. Whereas Angular, it gives you like, it's a framework, right? It gives you a box and you're writing code in that box. So it's very structured. It gives you Typescript. It gives you reactive programming, like, all of the asynchronous objects that you deal with here are already observables. So it's more structured. It's more scalable and maintainable. So TypeScript and reactive programming, these two things you'll have to learn, or you'll eventually pick up when you're trying to learn Angular. But it's very easy, and hopefully we can understand, like, if we can get another session, we can do like a hands-on on how these things work under the hood. But now I just want to talk a little bit about how Angular is structured and why, like, I call it as, the awesome framework for writing frontend. So Angular, if you just split up the box of what Angular is made of, how much time do I have? Just a minute. Okay. Like, if you want to just look at the what do you call architecture of Angular, it's very object oriented. If you can understand modules and components, it uses something called as dependency injection to inject services, and it uses event and property binding. For if you think of MVC pattern, your templates are your views, and the services can be the controllers, because they'll have the business logic, and they talk to the API, and they you can essentially inject them into the component, which is like basically your controller. Your component is kind of your controller. So it's very simple, and I want to go through this one or two more slides before we I think what I want to do. I mean, we can understand the difference between all these dependencies, but with how you can get started. So Angular.io is that has everything that you need to get started with Angular. But like, one of the best docs. Click on docs. Getting started allows you to Angular and see what it's made of. Understand Angular, like, these are the components, like, the fundamental building blocks of Angular injection. Like, these are the boxes that you'll need to understand Angular. Like, one of the best ways to get started is like the tutorial here, Tours of Heroes app. It is a very example driven app. Like, if you're starting with Angular, the way I learned Angular was I just looked up on this website and I started following the tutorial. I like to learn by doing. And then I follow the dictionary approach. Like, I just learn the thing that I need to understand that particular thing. So if you're following that pattern, you don't have to learn like everything A to Z like a book. If you're following, you just, like, if you're dealing with something, just understand that thing by looking up what it means. So this example is a very good one to get started with. And Angular Material is like the UI library that Angular uses. You can also use all other things with Angular, but Angular Material is made with Google Material Design. Leverage on that, you can use Angular Material. And you can also build your own interactions, own components using the Angular CDK, Component Development Kit. Like, you can use interactions like drag drop. You can build your own. It's really cool. Like, you just have to get started, and it gives you the freedom of creating your own things. And finally, I want to talk about StackBlitz. StackBlitz is like the online IDE. If you're getting started with Angular, and the tutorial of the Hero,
I'm sorry.
Tours of Hero.
I think we have to wrap up here. I'm very sorry.
Yes,
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Yes.
Yeah, no worries. I'll just say this. So StackBlitz.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll just finish
please.
this sentence.
Yeah.
No, go ahead. Yeah, so Stacklets, like if you see all these examples, if you just click on the demo, you'll be able to navigate to the Stacklets of this and play around with code basically. So this will be your online ID. You can see all of the code and the examples here. So that's pretty much it. All of the things that you will know to get started with Angular.
Thank you so much.
If you have any questions, please feel free to DM me on Twitter. Thank you.
Sorry, your voice is lagging. Did you want to say something? Oh. Thank you so much, Wafa. I